When Christopher Columbus first steps foot on Cuba, he says this is the most beautiful place in the world. Cuba has a very interesting history. The natives lived here for thousands of years without being bothered by anybody. You can kind of compare it to the natives of Hawaii. They lived here for centuries without being bothered by any powerful country. The greatest thing was nobody would try to control them, and they could live free. And best of all, they had no wars. And that is why they didn't really know how the world is ran anywhere else. When we get to 1492, this is when Christopher Columbus is the first outsider to visit this island. And after this island becomes a part of the Spanish Empire. The Spanish realized not only is this island beautiful, but it's great for farming sugar cane. And that is why they go to the continent of Africa and started bringing African slaves to this island and everywhere else in the Americas. Either way, we go all the way to the 19th century and this island still belongs to the Spanish Empire. But the Americans that are right next door to this island are very interested in it and they always go there to visit. You probably know, but in the 19th century, the Americans and the Spanish are at war, but in the west side of the United States, where it's called Mexico. When the Americans eventually get the west side of the United States and add it to their land, the war had not finished yet, and in some years, it gets taken to the Caribbean. But this is a time where the Spanish Empire is crumbling, and they're not the old empire they used to be. That is why in 1898, the Spanish decide to leave the island and give it to the US, and they also gave the Philippines to the United States. So Cuba is in the US's hands now, and they're trying to figure out what to do with it. The demographics of Cuba at this time are natives, mostly African slaves, and a very small percentage of Spanish people. Some people in the US government believe they should add Cuba as the next US state, but a lot of people in the Congress declined that, and they believe that we should never add this to the US. Because there's not enough white people here. And by white, we mean English people. Because a lot of Americans didn't even think Irish people are considered white, and they would treat them as second-class citizens. Either way, the US declines adding Cuba as a state, and that is why they pretty much give that land independence and allow them to create their own government. Alongside this, they take a small piece of Cuba and they say this is ours now. A place called Guantanamo Bay. A small country by the name of Cuba is created now, and its economy starts to boom very quickly. And the main reason was that you have this ginormous superpower with a lot of population next to you, and they all love to visit your island. The state of Florida is only 140 kilometers away from Cuba, so it's right next door, and that is why you could easily get on a boat or ship and sail down here to visit. And that's exactly what the people of US did back then. When we get to World War I, Europe is pretty much destroyed because they're just smashing each other around. And that is why on the other side of the pond, the economy is booming, especially for the US. And it's good to note that this is when the US took over the entire world in economy and became the most powerful economy in the world. And their number one vacation spot is Cuba. They loved Cuba so much that they named it 700 Miles of Fun. And if you want to know what 700 miles is, it's the length of this island, so it's actually pretty big. And 700 miles is about 1,130 kilometers. Since Cuba was such a tourist attraction, a lot of American companies started investing there. A lot of casinos, hotels, restaurants, everything started being built over there by American companies. But there is a giant issue forming. Most Cubans at that time were farmers, but they would leave their job and start working for US companies so they can make a little bit more money. And that is why they would either lose their farmland or sell it to move out. The Americans would usually buy them for cheap and start building more spots over there. After this took place, a lot of homelessness starts to rise in Cuba. And then we get to the 1930s when the Great Depression hits, and we've also made a video about the Great Depression if you would like to see it. After the 1930s, tourists don't have money to visit Cuba anymore, so their economy starts to go downhill. In this situation, the best thing people could do is go back to their farmland and start farming again. But unfortunately, that farmland does not belong to them anymore because a US government or company has it. When we get to the 1950s, the economy of the world had gotten back up, and Cuba was doing kind of good in terms of economy. But unfortunately, the people of Cuba were not happy about the way the government is being ran. The government would take the side of corporates all the time, and a government like this is called corporatism, where you always listen to the corporate and basically worship them. At this time, the idea of communism is being spread around the world by the USSR, especially Latin American countries. And the most famous one in this case is Cuba. We get to a point where everybody in Cuba is talking about communism, and they were always told that if our country turns communists, all of our problems will be solved and Cuba will be a heaven once again. All this is going on, and figures like Che Guevara and Fidel Castro are becoming very famous in Cuba. The Communist Party start a civil war against the government, and eventually they win the war, and Fidel Castro becomes the new leader of Cuba. The people were extremely happy. With the help of propaganda, they thought this place is gonna turn into a heaven. When Castro has absolute power, in under 9 months, he adds 1,500 new laws to the system. The rules were you have a higher salary, rent is lower, water and electricity are free, nobody can have huge pieces of land. It has to be cut up and given to everybody. All the farms belong to the government. People work in there and give the produce to the government. At this time, most of the hotels and factories and refineries belong to the US because they built all of them. But communist revolution has happened and they are all taken over by this regime. But the US government is not worried about the land and buildings they built and this government has taken over. They are afraid of communism, a communist ideology that's 100 miles away from them. Castro is a huge fan of the USSR and the idea of Marxism, and he's very good friends with the leaders over there, and the US is very worried about its own backyard, and that is why the US government decides to add an insane amount of sanctions. Like for example, Cuba had 3 giant refineries that were all built by the US, and after the communist revolution happened, the US wouldn't help them with parts and wouldn't help them run it, and they basically turned into a dead factory. All these sanctions put together has left Cuba back in the 1950s. And when you look at the cars in Cuba, most of them are 1950s American car, which they keep fixing and driving around. An island that 60 years ago could have been a part of the United States is now one of the worst nightmares for the US government. After this, any factory that is formed in this country, any school that's open, any place that makes money belongs to the government and has to be controlled by the government. Everybody knows that governments don't know how to run a business. And that means if they have a factory in their hands, it will probably lose money rather than gain a profit. Unfortunately, Cuba and every other communist country suffers from this. You can even see this in the most capitalistic country in the world. There are a lot of postal companies in the US, and most of them are private. But one of those is ran by the government, which is called the USPS. Even though USPS has a ginormous budget and they have a lot of employees, it actually loses money rather than makes a profit every year. But when you compare them to private companies like FedEx and UPS, they make a lot more profit and spend less money. Everybody knows this. When you have a country where everything is controlled by government, there is no responsibility and nobody does their job correctly. In this situation like Cuba, the entire company of USPS is turned into the whole country. There is zero profits and you're losing money each year. Socialist and Marxist ideas sound good and they look good on paper, but all this doesn't work in reality, and it has failed its test plenty of times around the world, and not one has been successful. They first say we want to create a communist utopia. Then, when they gain absolute power over the people, they kill anyone that stands in their way or is against their ideology. They kill the rich people and take their goods. They take all the land, make everybody poor so everybody's equal. And a very small few of those people are living in that utopia they were always talking about. In the end, people start starving. They start to despise communism, and they say anything but communism. One of those examples is Romania, which we've made a video about. The island of Cuba is located in one of the most beautiful places in the entire world. It's next to the most powerful and rich country in the world. It has a lot of useful land, beautiful beaches, but unfortunately, it's extremely poor. The US has a lot at fault at this too, because it was so against the idea of communism. They sanctioned this country to death, and the sanctions continue to this day. Even with all that going on, Cuba is an extremely beautiful country, and in recent times, the US allows its citizens to visit Cuba again. Another interesting fact about Cuba and Cuban people is that the most anti-communist people in the US are Cuban Americans. Cuban Americans hate communists so much that you can't believe it, and most of them live in the state of Florida, which is kind of similar to Cuban weather. If you speak highly of Karl Marx, socialism, communism, or any communist leader, you might get a slap in the face.